I'm going to share my screen with everyone so that way we can go ahead and jump in and get started. So we are jumping into our back into our Jedi workshop sessions, and I'm super excited about it. So just want to kind of go over a couple of logistical things, and also just acknowledge that, you know, in the session that we did before collectively, there was a lot of content, and one, we were attempting to build a container for this work, and that was what the ultimate goal was. And two, we also definitely heard you all as a board. We heard your voice, and we want to make sure that, you know, as we go into these conversations and continue these conversations, it does have a feeling of how do I apply this as a board member or just collectively as a body? How do we make this something that is relevant to what we do? So I am hoping that with that being said, as we do these two sessions over tonight and tomorrow night, all of you are willing to engage and make this something that is more conversation driven than content driven. So that is the ultimate goal. So just to kind of go over the agenda, we are going to take a deep dive into privilege, kind of define it and have conversation about it. There's a lot of perspective that is defined in that word, or that surrounds that word. So definitely want to make sure that everybody knows and understands that this is an opportunity for perspective as we have these conversations. We're also going to talk about the power of perspective and, you know, what that does whenever we are engaged in a collective body, as we're leading and as we're serving members of our constituency, our district, or our community, just the power of perspective and the importance of that. Also, kind of a little bit, somewhat in contrast, is the reality of perception. We're going to talk about just what the reality of perception can bring into a space where we are making decisions and we are representing others that may walk a different pathway. And then there will be some reflection questions. We'll talk about a false sense of power. And then we will also explore intersectionality versus interconnectedness. And then we will have some workshop discussion questions that we'll jump into as well. So again, we are really hoping that this is going to be something that allows us to have a conversation. There will be concept that is going to be presented, and there'll be you know, some things that we talk about, but we really do want this to be a conversation. So to establish some meeting norms before we jump in this space, it really is okay to be brave. Be brave, be respectful, be uncomfortable. If this is a conversation that can you know, cause you to feel some sense of uncomfort or discomfort, that's okay. That's something that is absolutely okay. It also is very okay to stumble in these conversations. This is forever work for all of us. So we can stumble, and that is a sign of growth. And as we stumble, there's opportunity for us to learn from that. And then also engage. That's I think one of the more challenging pieces is to engage. You know, as we're having conversations like this, you definitely receive it. It might resonate, but the expression and the speaking into what that makes you feel, what that makes you think about, that's what can be difficult, and that's what can be a little bit challenging. And interestingly enough, if we were all jumping on this Zoom call tonight and we were logging into an accounting class, or if we were logging in to do a lab of some sort, or, you know, hey, just for the sake of conversation, if we were all getting together to practice a sport, we would find ourselves in a space where we would give ourselves room to grow. We would come into this space knowing that we are not the experts. We're not always at our best when we're in practice or when we're trying to learn something. And we would be comfortable with that, and we would accept that. We would be familiar with that. We would be okay with it. But when it matters the most in conversations like this, that's where we can also explore that as well. We can also be okay with growing. We can be okay with, you know, not being the best in the room, or this is something that we have to give ourselves room to grow in this space as well. So as a member of the Colorado community, I just implore you to be vulnerable and explore your feelings, explore your thoughts. As a community, we want to see you stumble, because we know that that is a sign of growth. So just really want to encourage everybody and let you know that it is okay. All right, so If you've ever flown west to east or east to west in the United States, LA to New York or New York to LA, you would experience a different flight pattern. You would experience a different flight time. So it takes 5 hours and 16 minutes to fly from LAX to JFK, but interestingly enough, it takes 6 hours and 34 minutes to fly from JFK to LAX. If you get on the same plane, if you fly on the same day, you're going to experience a different flight experience. And so when we see data like this, it's very easy to make some assumptions. We can either assume that the plane that we're flying on going from LA to JFK is more efficient, or the one coming from New York to LA is less efficient. Or we can assume that the pilots are more skilled. Maybe, for that particular flight, the pilot might have a little bit more skill set. They know how to navigate a little bit better. But in reality, what happens is when you're flying from LA to New York, you get favorable tailwinds that push that plane is being pushed faster because of the favorable tailwinds. And when you're flying from New York to LA, you find yourself in a headwind, and that is causing an unfavorable approach. So it's not something that, it's let's blame the equipment or let's blame the pilot. It's actually structural. It's actually something that has nothing to do with anything that is, designed by us. It's something that is structural. It is simply because the tailwind versus the headwind is causing that to create a different experience. So when you go from LA to New York, one can argue that this is a better flight experience, or that's the one that I should be pursuing. But that 78 minutes again from New York to LA is because of that headwind that's unfavorable. So it's easy to assume that again, there's something else that is causing this LA to New York experience to be better, if you will, or more efficient. But again, it's not something that's created by the pilots themselves. So I use this analogy because it can ground us in the conversation about privilege. Because when we talk about privilege is something that can be accounted to just the way that you're born, the things that you have at birth that someone else might not have. And so it doesn't necessarily classify more efficiency. It's something that is more, it's a tailwind or it's a headwind. So we're going to do a little bit of an introspective exercise and start out there and just kind of talk about examples of privilege. So as we do this exercise, I encourage you to either keep track of, I'm going to give you a series of scenarios, and keep track of your answers, and then also keep track of what does it make you feel, or how do you feel knowing that that's the answer to the scenario in your world. So keep track of it. You can write it down or just kind of track it in your mind. So the first question, and I will give you all a little bit of time to reflect on how it makes you feel. So I'll give a little bit of space and some dead air to allow you all to do that. So the first scenario or question is, have you ever felt that you needed to hide a symbol of your religion to be respected or to be safe? So again, that question is, have you ever felt that you needed to hide a symbol of your religion to be respected or to be safe? And if the answer to that question is no, then you have lived with less anxiety than many followers of religions perceived as inferior or dangerous, such as Islam or religions of African origin in certain regions of the world. So I'm going to give you all a moment to just kind of reflect on how the answer to that question or that scenario makes you feel. All right, the second question, do you feel safe holding your current or maybe a former partner's hand in public without fear of suffering aggression? Again, that question is, do you feel safe, or did you feel safe holding your current or former partner's hand in public without fear of suffering aggression? And if the answer to that question is yes, you have enjoyed a freedom that was not always available to everyone of color and or those of the LGBTQIA community. And if you can reflect on how that makes you feel. All right, here's the third question. When you go out on your own, do you have to consider the environment being accessible? Again, when you go out on your own, do you have to consider the environment being accessible? And if the answer to that question is no, you have lived with more comfort than those that have the presence of a disability. And here's the last one. Have you ever been told or have had to tell a loved one that because of their skin color, they need to be overly submissive if ever engaging with law enforcement for the sake of making it through the engagement alive? And again, that question is, have you ever been told or have had to tell a loved one that because of their skin color, they need to be overly submissive if ever engaging with law enforcement for the sake of making it through the engagement alive? If the answer to that question is no, you have lived with less apprehension than the African American community.
Ma'am?
Yes.
Just a comment. You know, the term that, you know, was only African American, I think is not inclusive. As a Latina, it is all people. You're talking about people of color, correct?
Absolutely.
All right, thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Director Williams, I think you have your hand raised.
I do, thank you. And I have lived all over the world, so I have had that experience. So it's not just Latinas or African Americans, depending on where you are, that experience can be based on your skin color of a different color.
Thank you, Director Williams. And that is a great segue to open up to ask if anyone wants to share. Director Williams.
Me again. Me again. So I don't think you have to have a disability to be conscious of the environment being accessible. I think that many of us in this meeting are of an age where we have to be continually conscious of that. And I think that anybody who has a family member or works in the environment has to be aware of that. So I think it's too narrow to say that it's only people with a disability who have to be aware of that.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And so in the scenario, it was identifying that you live with more comfort, not necessarily lack of awareness, but you do live with more comfort than those that have a presence of disability. But that is a great point, that the awareness piece absolutely is the ultimate goal. And that's the beauty that comes through perspective. But yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Director Davidson.
Yeah, thanks. I thought I would just share, you asked us, how do we feel about each of those? And this may be a cop out, but the word I come back to is privileged. I think it's the things you don't have to think about. And, we all go through change in life. So sometimes when you have something that changes on you, you start to, it's easier to recognize how privileged you were before. So the one that stuck out to me was actually the one about accessibility, because I think we all recognize that we're either years away, an illness away, an accident away from everything completely changing. So anyway, I thought I would just share that. It may be a cop-out, but I think the word privilege is a good one, because at the end of those that the answer is no, the word is privileged. It's pointed out. And how do you feel about not having to think about it? It's fortunate. Thanks.
Of course. Ms. McManus.
Yes. Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. I was wondering, after we present some of these questions when we're having the discussion, if you could take the presentation down so we could all see each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Love that. Love that suggestion. Thank you kindly. So I will definitely facilitate it that way.
Thank you.
Of course. Additional thoughts and feelings.
Are we discussing? Are we calling?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Director DeShill.
I think, one thing that I found that I actively work on is, for the times when I, to use Director Davidson's, although I have that privilege, I immediately switch to a problem solving mode in my mind. Okay, well, I have that privilege, and now what? And how do I help others? But also recognizing that I know that that's not always necessarily the immediate next step. And also, there's a feeling of frustration when you're I find often being in a position of privilege, when you have the inability to problem solve, can be challenging. I'm thinking about the ways in which that community would like to be problem solved, and the way that community is, as opposed to the more paternalistic, what can I do? So that was a feeling, an internal dialogue.
Absolutely. And that is, that is the place where you have to find yourself being careful, as you engage in wanting to problem solve or wanting to leverage the privilege that you have to impact change. You want to make sure that you're not now trying to speak for someone that is in a different scenario, and more so finding that balance of how you create a platform to elevate the voices of those that need that support, versus kind of trying to come in and have the answers or create an answer without extending that perspective. So that is absolutely, thank you for sharing that. So I think that in some cases, the tricky part about thinking about or talking about privilege, especially if it's something that is being advised, or we're recognizing that we are afforded that privilege. Sometimes when the topic comes up, it comes up with this sense of reluctance. You can find yourself saying, privilege? Are you kidding me? Like, I worked hard for what I have. Like, there is no privilege. I didn't have privilege. I had to work hard for what I had. And some studies will show that, when we're confronted with data of our own privilege, we tend to change the way that we tell our story. And we tend to add things to our narrative that reinforce that while I might be in a group that is privileged, that, I'm going to start highlighting my mishaps and highlighting the issues that I had to overcome. And you can sometimes find yourself saying, I don't enjoy as much privilege as people in my privileged group. And that's another place where, we have to be careful, because once we start recreating our narrative and we start to, kind of bring in what we had to experience in order to overcome, again, that is something that it typically is that pushback that we give when it's just time to acknowledge privilege. So it's not, acknowledgement of privilege does not eliminate your story. It does not invalidate your story, but the acknowledgement of privilege does offer you opportunity to start looking for and seeking perspective, because that's an important piece of, while we're going through our narrative and we're creating this space of story, we have to be careful, and because that can definitely shut our eyes to perspective. Director Williams.
And don't you think that works both ways? Don't you think that works? Don't you think that somebody who says they are not privileged also recreates their story to support that position?
So someone that says that I'm not privileged, they are recreating the story to support the position of not being privileged?
Uh-huh.
They very well could, yeah. And so when you find yourself, just as an introspective, if you find yourself saying, hey, I'm not privileged, because we all experience privilege in some way, right? And so with that being said, as we are trying to go into these conversations and acknowledge our own privilege, it's not to invalidate the story or the journey that we're taking. That's not what that's not what the acknowledgement is designed for. The acknowledgement is to allow for us to break down those barriers and say, let me start seeking perspective. Let me actually take the initiative and start engaging in a different way. And as opposed to trying to protect ourselves and revolt, if you will, we are opening up ourselves to say, I am now going to be seeking perspective so that I can start to understand and I can start to gain understanding. And whatever privileges I do have, let me leverage that to impact change.
Or whatever privileges I don't have, then I would be coming from that position and willing to work to change that for everybody, myself included.
Yes, and more than likely, when we're not privileged and we find ourselves in that position of not being privileged, that typically we don't always need somebody to give us space to acknowledge it. We are happy to volunteer and say, hey, something needs to change, because we're aware of that.
Or sometimes when you find yourself in a position where you are among the underprivileged, you tend to hide because there's fear involved in that. So it's an interesting discussion of what we put out and how we adopt our lives and our stories and our behaviors to reflect how we feel about the situation that we are in. And I think that's true for everything.
Gotcha. And when you say when you're among the underprivileged, is that like just being in proximity or having meaningful relationships? Like what like when you say that, you know,
I have been in situations where I was an underprivileged person.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, so I had to live in that space. And I have had situations, this being one of them, where I am certainly a privileged person. And I'm privileged to have a paid professional teaching me how to be better in a situation. So there are a lot of people who don't have that privilege. So I'm just saying that we all live and move and adjust our lives for the situation that we are in at any given moment.
Gotcha. Yeah, and the choices that we make in those adjustments are super, super important. Thank you so much, Director Williams. Director Tisdale, grandpa duty.
Grandpa duty indeed. Thank you. I very much appreciate your observation that an acknowledgement of privilege does not invalidate your story. And I think, and in the private discussions that we had and what you have done in the prior sessions, I think you've given us a very even-handed and balanced discussion about all of these things. The problem that I have seen and where I appreciate some guidance is that the concept of privilege, regrettably, has been weaponized and universalized so as to trivialize the individual. And I think to the extent that we can take to heart what you have said, that an acknowledge of privilege does not invalidate your story, I think that's an important part of the message as we go forward. And it's a challenge because, as I say, it truly the concept and the discussion has been weaponized. And I believe by this universalizing of it, it does trivialize the individual and creates a mechanic for seeking atonement or reparation from an individual, whereas what we're talking about is a societal discussion. And it's not that Fred is a person of privilege and so now Fred must atone and make reparations, but rather that Fred should participate in the breaking down of barriers across society in order to create a sense of equality throughout. And we get to your slide about equality and equity. I have a discourse planned for that too, so I'll save that for later. But I wanted to share that, and I thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing, Director Tisdale. And you're right, that as it pertains to the acknowledgement piece, it's, you know, once we can remove that feeling of defensive, we can start to really have conversations that are partnering and that can honor the stories of those that are in the room and those that are at the table. Because when you can remove that piece and we can come away from trying to, find ourselves feeling either invalidated. So now I have to validate my story and say, wait a second, let me tell you what I've been through, right? So if we take that piece away and say, if I'm acknowledging it, it's not invalidating what I've done, it does give us room now to come to the table without our defenses truly up. So, and it is a responsibility as well to, say, hey, once I acknowledge my privilege, now I can take an active role and I can play an active role in how we can start seeking equity and how we can start seeking things that can help to impact change. And, if we go into this with the notion of branding the system and not the people, like you said with Fred, if I'm branding the system and not the people, then now, Fred, I can see you as who you are, and we can collectively and collaborate as we push back against the system. So thank you, Director Tisdale. Director Williams.
I think that was very well said on Doug's part and on your part. And I think that that is why we are all here. I think we are all in our position because we care about how the system serves people and how public transportation is important. I think that we are here on a Wednesday night donating our time because we want to help whatever situation we find ourselves in. And so I think I'm privileged to be amongst this group of people. So thank you all.
Thank you, Director Williams. It is a privilege to have a seat at the table for sure. Any other thoughts that, or anything else that anyone wants to share? Okay, if something resonates and comes up, by all means, you can definitely come back to this piece. I'm going to take us forward in the presentation. So in this image here, let's pretend here that each person in each row represents everyone in the country. And everyone in the country has a chance to become wealthy or to see success and you know, build their legacy and be a part of that dream. All they have to do in order to do that is get their balled up piece of paper in the bin that's in front of each of them while sitting in their seat. So while there will be effort made by each person, strategy and emotions are much different based on the place that they are in this photo. So the persons in the second and third rows who can clearly see the difference in opportunity are going to have a compelling desire to speak up about the unfairness of this opportunity. And there will even be different emotions coming from the person that is in the third row versus the second row. The person in the first row is going to be strategic, and they are going to do their diligence to work hard to get that ball of paper in the basket because they're going to want to figure out how to achieve the desired outcome. But what they aren't going to naturally see is how they have an advantage. All the person in the front row is going to see is that there's about 10 feet in front of them in order to get that ball of paper in the bin. So as we are talking about, you know, privilege and acknowledgement of privilege, you know, there starts to become there's a sense of bounded rationality. And I'm going to kind of explain what that means. So the brain, the way that our brains work, it relies on shortcuts to do a lot of our work. So, excuse me, a lot of times our mental processes are taking place outside of our awareness. So there's studies that are out there that will tell you that there's about 40 million things coming at your brain at any given time. At any given time, there literally are millions of things coming at you. And the brain, the functionality of the brain can only handle a fraction of that. So a good example of this is if you're driving home from work and you get home and you walk in the door, sometimes you realize that drive was hypnotic. Like the green lights, the red lights, all of that was hypnotic. Or you might go to your refrigerator and you know you're looking for your butter in the refrigerator. And you swear to yourself, like, there's no butter in this refrigerator. I thought that it was here, but it's not there. And then you take a moment of pause and then you look and it's right in front of your face. And so those are kind of like the moments that we laugh about. Those are the oops moments in our life that we laugh about. But at some point, you know, just because of that, the bounded rationality, there's sometimes we can't see something that's right in front of our face. And so as we carry that concept into privilege, like for instance, in this diagram, the person that doesn't experience what the person in the back row is experiencing, they know someone's back there, but again, all they're looking at and all they're seeing is that there is a bin in front of them, and I'm just trying to get a desired outcome. So I'm gonna throw this in here. I'm gonna be strategic, I'm gonna work hard, I'm gonna try to figure it out. And so they're not naturally aware of the privilege that they're experiencing, yet the people in the second row and the third row are very much aware because they are living through the experiences of being in the second row or the third row. So it can be right there in front of us, and there can be this acknowledgement that there's somebody behind me, but not understanding the perspectives of the people that are behind me. It makes it very hard for me to have that perspective of someone in the third row. Director Williams.
Yeah, I have a problem with this too, because if I'm the person in the third row, just me, I'm so competitive that I'm saying, watch this. You know, I can do as good a job as the person in the first row, right from where I'm sitting. So I think that it's an attitude of what you do. You know, maybe you sitting in the third row feel like you are underprivileged, but I don't feel like I'm underprivileged sitting in the third row. I feel like, here we go, you know? And if you notice, my thing is going to go right in the bucket too. So I think we should include in this conversation that it's a matter of how you deal with the situation and how you react to it. Anybody else here? Doug, you feel like you're not going to make that basket? I think you're going to make it.
So Director DeShiel, I'm going to come to you here, but I just want to kind of elaborate a little bit. So it's not to say that the person in the back can't make the bucket. Actually, the person in the back is probably going to eventually be more skilled at the arch, at the velocity, at the mathematics that's required. However, at the same time, the concept that we're speaking into is the fact that there's acknowledgement that there are different places that we have to start. And we have a choice. We have a choice to accept that, and we have a choice for that to be something that we will simply say, hey, you know what, no matter who's in front of me, I'm gonna just go ahead and I'm gonna just work with what I have back here. You have a choice of how you're going to engage, but it doesn't negate that there are, in fact, differences in how opportunities are presented to us. Director DeShiel.
Yeah, I was just going to build on what you said in response to Director Williams, which is that, yes, people can work hard and have attitude, and that absolutely plays a role, but I think it sort of gets dangerously close to the idea that, well, you can just fix the societal problem by fixing your attitude. And Director Williams, I don't think that's what you were saying at all, but I think that, you know, at the end of the day, the person in the third row has to be twice, 3 times as good as the person in the first row to get the same outcome. So it's not really the attitude piece, or that portion. It's really about the acknowledgement of the systemic barrier, and that certain people have to be twice as good, 3 times as good, 4 times as good as someone who might have more privilege, more access to get the same result. And that's a challenge. And that, I think, is on us as
It's been one of the basic decisions that women have had for 100 years, that I have to be twice as good at what I'm doing as you.
Yes.
I'm a woman and you are obviously not. So I think that my point was that the discussion about, and again, we're back to privilege, allows for all kinds of room to move around in it. We could be here for a very long time talking about what groups are underprivileged and how that has played out. The nice part about RTD is that we don't care what country you came from or what your sex is, or what your religion is. When we provide public transit, it's very, very equitable, as a matter of fact. Cool beans.
Director Whitmore.
So when I look at that chart, I stereotypically would put myself in the front row seat with the short shot to the basket, which I would miss. That's has nothing to do with the slide, just my acumen. But I guess I look at that, and over time, I try to pride myself, and I think this Brady Bunch screen of people would say, at least in the short term, here's what I'm going to do. Front row guy and second row female, duck your damn heads so they have a better shot. Better yet, let's switch positions. Let's move the chairs around. I think that's probably what struck me is we can't just leave the chairs the way they are. And I think that's probably part of your message. I don't know. I just thought of that and went, yeah, let's rearrange things. I mean, that's not going to fix problems, but it's a start, right? Maybe.
Yeah, and that's a series of choices, right? That's a series of choices in leadership. That's a series of choices in the way that we imagine access. You know, there's opportunity to say, let's reimagine access and let's see what happens there. And let's continue to create situations where there are opportunities for people to experience this. Like you said, let me switch places with you real quick. Let's see how that, that opportunity plays itself out. And, it definitely opens up opportunity for perspective. And again, it's a series of choices. Do you accept that there are 3 rows, or do you say, let's stop let's halt what we're doing right now and let's switch the chairs around, make it a circle, make it something else. So definitely it starts to create a series of choices, which is a great opportunity in leadership. Director Tisdale.
Thank you. I just couldn't help but come up with this thought when Director Williams made her comments, and the phrase is backwards and in heels, which is the description that was given to describe how Ginger Rogers had to perform compared to Fred Astaire. She had to do everything backwards and in heels. Thank you.
Director Davidson.
Yeah, thanks. Something I'd throw out for the group that helps me a lot is I'm sitting up in the front row with Director Whitmore there, probably not making the basket as well. But one thing I think that can get really overwhelming is life is more like, it's not the single row. It's a big theater. It's 3-dimensional. It's got height. It's got depth. And so you have all kinds of different things. And I think one thing that can become so overwhelming that you ignore where the seats are and you just choose not to move the seats or contribute to that. But one thing I think that's really cool about the way you ask the questions about privilege is there's different types of privilege. And the only way, at least I think, and maybe it's my engineering got to break a problem down mindset, but the only way to tackle it is to specialize on some of those privileges, to recognize them, to see that row, to see where that is, and tackle that problem. So there may be privilege of religion, there may be privilege of race, there may be privilege of sexual preference, etc. But I think it's really helpful not to kind of, to be able to ask yourself those questions. Have I ever thought about this before? Has this ever been an obstruction to me before? It hasn't. I've never thought about it in any way. I'm probably on the front row on that issue. Who's behind me? How do I restructure? Anyway, I thought I'd just point out that for me, it's actually helpful the way you phrase those questions of having different areas to focus on. And then you can choose and say, kind of like, I'm going to a breast cancer walk today. I'm focusing on that because that's the problem I'm aware of right now. Anyway, I just thought that was kind of interesting in the way you asked the questions about privilege and the way we're looking at that singular row. Thanks.
Yes, absolutely. Of course. Director Geisinger.
Yeah, I just was thinking yesterday while I was doing some things, I watched a presentation by Memoris Theatre, and it was 2 young men, Black men, that were part of the theater. If you don't know Memoris Theatre, they do a lot of diversity theater, bringing stories forward, immigrant stories, and these 2 men. It was these 2 young Black men and then 2 leaders from the ACLU, the state executive director and another woman from the board. And both of these men had been spent time in prison for drug violations. One of them had been vice president of his class. He got a full ride scholarship for playing football somewhere, and was an honors student, and got thrown out of his house and went out and robbed a Blockbuster one night. And, it just struck me how far back, and not that it was not something I knew, but how far back people in that back row sometimes are. Can't get a job at Home Depot. You can't. People just turn away immediately. So it really can be, that last row can be debilitating.
That is a great point. Because if we expanded this picture and made it a classroom style, you've got multiple rows, you've got multiple, columns of rows, and someone is in the far corner perpendicular to this basket, that's even a difference of someone that might be centered to it and in the third row. So there are different variations when you talk about just the presence of opportunity. It comes in different forms. It's not always just cut and dry, 1, 2, 3. There are so many different layers of this that, perspective allows us to understand what, especially if you are in the first row, trying to understand everything that's happening behind you. The only way you can do that is to turn around. That's the only way. And listen, right? Like that's the only way that you can truly understand just the dynamics of how much people, how removed people are from opportunity. So thank you for that, Director Geisinger. Thank you. Any other thoughts or perspectives? Okay, so when we start to see people in this third row, this proverbial third row, start to get the ball in the basket, we start to see headlines of celebration, rightfully so, right? We start to navigate these conversations about people doing it backwards with heels on, right? We start to celebrate that. We have conversation. We retell those stories. We're excited to see it because it's so incredible knowing that that person had to overcome triumph in order to get that bucket or that ball of paper in the bucket. But this is where we start to create opportunity and we start to create choice. Are we okay? I mean, these stories are incredible. They're phenomenal. Are we okay with it being something that we as a society put it right in our face? The first person to ever, the first Black student to ever, the first Black woman, the first person with the presence of a disability. We celebrate it absolutely, but what happens thereafter? Are we okay with that being the first, the only? The story that we retell 50 years later because this woman did it and she overdid these men and these performances that she did. Are we going to keep retelling that story? Or are we going to make a choice as leaders in our city to say, I don't want her to be the first and the only. I want to celebrate her, or I want to celebrate, them or whomever. I want to celebrate them, but I don't want that to be a story that we're telling 50 years later. Can we normalize these opportunities, and can we normalize this incredible? Because imagine if you do rearrange the chairs and now we are maybe all in a circle trying to get our ball in the basket. The incredible talents and the incredible just the incredibleness of people. Just imagine what they can do now that we are in a circle, and imagine how much I can learn from that person, because now I can see you. You can learn from me. I can learn from you. How the heck did you do that backwards with heels on? Show me. Because now I have proximity. Now I have an opportunity to create a meaningful relationship. And instead of you being back there shooting it behind me, I don't even know how you're doing it. Now let's all come together. Now I can see how you're doing it. And now scarcity we start to normalize these things that are happening. Because again, we are, as a society, we are so quick to say, wow, the first person to ever be the valedictorian to Harvard. And that story is not more than maybe 3 years old. Are we going to be still talking about this young man, Devin Tumlin? Are we going to be retelling that story 50 years later? Or will that be normalized to where it's like, hey, that happened? Director Williams.
Yeah, this is so cool because I don't know if you know this, but RTD was the first agency to experience accessibility when the Gang of 19 laid down in front of the Capitol building in front of an RTD bus, and we continue to lead in accessibility. We are one of the few agencies in the country that can say that we are 100% accessible. We don't have any vehicles or any stations or any buses or anything. We are, and we continue to demonstrate to the rest of the country how that can work, and to partner with, we have not one, but two internal councils for accessibility that continue to give us feedback. And they report to this board and we get to listen to them all the time. So it is a good thing to be first as long as it's continuing. And I think we should be proud of the fact that we are doing that.
That is really exciting. And just a quick question for you, Director Williams. You know, as the first, and you know, it sounds like leading in this space, it kind of leads into that question of now what, right? We did this. We were the first. Now what? Where does RTD go from there? As a board and as a collective body, where do you say, hey, we did this. We turned it into a circle. So, hey, city adjacent to me or state adjacent to me, how do you empower that voice to say that we should not, we're the first, but we shouldn't be the only? Like what opportunities do you see for you all as a board to explore that and to expand that and say we shouldn't be the only?
Director Tisdale, are you carrying that to our national transit folks? I'm sure you are. APTA. Doug, you know, we know.
Yeah, I could not hear the question. Would you mind just repeating it? I'm having some
I think that
background.
Mediana was saying, since we are the first and we are 100% accessible, now what are we doing to ensure that we perpetrate that action for other states and other agencies? And I answered that I think you should be the person to answer that.
Yeah, well, among other things, what we have been doing, and I look at the racial equity plan that APTA recently adopted through the executive committee, and then the full board ratified that. I want RTD to be one of the agencies that officially goes on record. I know we have it, but I don't know that we have formally, I believe we have not yet formally adopted it, and I think we need to. And I like to tell the story about RTD concerning things such as accessibility, which you have just described, when we have our meetings of both the executive committee and the transit board members committee, where we get to brag about things like that. So yes, there are some bragging rights, and it reminds me of the old story. Okay, so you won a Pulitzer Prize. What are you going to do next year? So we constantly have to be aware of and work toward continuous quality improvement.
Thank you, Director Tisdale. Any other thoughts on just, you know, collectively when we talk about you know, privilege, and then when someone does make that basket from afar, the way that we celebrate and how we can move from saying celebrating the first and making sure that it's not the only.
So we have to keep listening. We have to keep listening to our constituents and to our writers and to our advisory council for people with disabilities and to our, what do they call that equity department now, Carl Green and those guys. You know, we have to continue to pay attention.
Thank you, Director Williams. Director DeShiel.
Yeah, I think, you know, building on Director Williams, what Director Williams mentioned is also not being complacent might not be the right word, but sort of resting on our laurels, right? It's good to celebrate that we are accessible. And how do we provide that same liberation to others in our community without having to have 19 of them lie down in front of us, right? And I'm sure fight and continue to fight and work day in and day out, right? We memorialize it through a committee, but and Director Davidson's metaphor, Ian's metaphor, right? As we look at the other roads where people are sitting in the third row, how do we take that same liberation and apply it to the other people sitting in the third row? Where, yes, we should celebrate it, and we should use our work in paratransit and transit accessibility to liberate other communities that aren't our own. And there's a lot of communities here that are seeking that same accessibility because it's transit. and mobility and jobs and, you know, all the things that having access to transit provides. I think that's I mean, really important for us to think through. Right? Is it shouldn't have to be as hard for the next person.
I love what you said, Director DeShiel. And I'm going to ask a little bit more of a question collectively as a board here to see if we can kind of engage. But I'll go to Director Bouquet first, and then I'll jump into that.
Yeah, perfect. I think, and I've talked to you before about this, and I think I've brought this up prior to my other board members, but it goes beyond acknowledgement, but to action. So it's one thing to, you know, acknowledge a first. It's one thing to acknowledge, you know, someone making the basket, and it's a whole nother thing to say, or even acknowledge that there are different standing points where you can, you know, shoot your paper ball from. It's a whole nother step to actually act upon it, because then it just becomes symbolic, you know, then it just becomes lip service. If you say, oh, we know there's systematic problems, but if we come, you know, for us as a board of 15 where, you know, we have authority, how are we exactly using that authority, you know, to fix the systematic issues that are in place rather than just acknowledge them? That would just be my point I would make.
Thank you, Director Bouquet. You know, Director DeShiel, you had mentioned, you know, the, you know, celebrating that, you know, RTD has definitely found its place in, you know, accessibility and equity, and it came from those 19 people that that took a stand. And so it kind of becomes a conversation of reactive versus responsive. So just kind of would love to hear you all engage or get thoughts on just as a board and how you all engage in this space, and where does privilege come into this space, and how do you all create an opportunity for there to be acknowledgement of privilege and an opportunity to challenge yourselves to see action, to make a choice. You know, just kind of what does that culture feel like? What does it look like? And how does privilege play a part in the way that you all engage as board members? And I am definitely going to let the dead silence play its course. So please take time to think about that. And I would love to hear just thoughts on just how privilege plays that role and how it can impact also you all being responsive versus reactive.
I think we are largely, historically, certainly have been reaction oriented. I think it often takes, like with many government agencies, and it takes a large action, a show of people force often, I think, for us to make decisions, or to put an issue that we know exists and really put that spotlight on it. And I think we're starting to shift to be more responsive. I think the plans that we've seen for more public outreach and engagement have been incredibly robust, and can be greater, and we continue to see improvement. But I think we have been reactionary, and much more reactive. They're not to get too sort of business or aligned in that sense, but I don't know that equity has been a guiding principle, right? Of that inclusion has been a strategic outcome, to borrow from our other consultants' favorite words. I don't know that that's been a strategic outcome for the agency, and as a result, right, we're always going to be reactive. If that's not a goal of ours, right? The goal of ours is not to shift from reaction to response, then we're always going to be sort of on our heels on a lot of these issues.
Gotcha. Do you think, Director DeShiel, that privilege plays a role in that?
I do, because it's, I think a lot of our goals are based on improving the status quo, right? But a lot of times the status quo doesn't the metrics that we use for improving the status quo, right? There's a privilege there that may not acknowledge those who don't have any transit, right? It's one of the most common questions I think I hear certainly on when we're doing route service changes is, well, how do you know if you need a new route if there's not a route there, right? And all of us have probably heard some version of that question when it comes to service planning. But it's the privilege to not think about it, right? It's not a part of the plan because it's not something that is elevated to the level of, if someone's focused heavily on on-time performance, well, some other people might say, well, I have no performance, let alone on-time performance. So let's start with some performance to try to contextualize it in transit. So I think the privilege of, again, right, the blinders on of, oh, well, we do X and I can improve X doesn't even acknowledge that there might be a whole other world that isn't a current input in what we're trying to do. And there's a mass privilege there.
Got it. Thank you. Director Williams.
I had to find my pointer to get to the unmute and all that good stuff. So this board as a group is getting ready to address some of the most difficult questions that RTD has ever had to address concerning equality, equity, where we put routes, where we don't put routes. We have some really tough decisions to make. We are maxed out in terms of what service we have in buses and operators. And so every time that we put new routes one place, we have to take a route away from someplace else. And we have been having those discussions, and we will continue to have those discussions based on the situation that we find ourselves in. So I think that privilege is implicit in this in a variety of ways, particularly because we are come to a point that if we put a route in Jeffco, we have to take one away from Colfax, just making it up. And so we have been dealing with equity geographically and equity in a variety of ways. And I think that this group is about to make some really big moves, if you've been following the system optimization plan, that are dealing with exactly the kind of issues that we are talking about here tonight.
Thank you, Director Williams. You all do have a very tall order. I will say you have a very tall order that is coming your way. And I do think that as you all engage collectively, I do think that acknowledgement of privilege is going to be a part of that, could be a part of shaping and creating a container that allows you to really pour in and to seek perspective. Director Cook.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
This is kind of tangential, but with regard to the challenge that we face, as Director Williams, Kate Williams talked about, I would urge that we not view that or other prickly issues as zero-sum games if we don't have to. So let's not assume right away that there are going to be winners and losers. If there are ways to explore interests that we can make a bigger pie, that would just be my comment. It's not specifically germane, but to the extent, Director Williams had commented, I wanted to insert that thought as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Cook. Can I ask you to speak into that a little more? Like you said, don't look at it, but there's winners and losers. Can you speak into that a little bit more and just talk into how you create or how you all as a board can create a container like that to where you can see it as we're not going to have winners and losers, but more so we're going to just expand the pie. Just can you speak into how you create that space or what your thoughts are on how to create a space like that?
Yeah, I would assume that there are ways to explore needs and the means of achieving them. and the constraints we face, that would mean we wouldn't necessarily have to take away from one area or one group of people in order to provide service to another one. So it would be exploring that, asking more questions that help to lead to those, I don't know if I can call them win-wins, but I can call them a bigger pie that provides more service, but maybe not in the same ways in all places. So that idea of exploring interests to see if there is a different way to approach the problem.
Gotcha. It sounds like that's definitely an exercise of perspective. Definitely leaning in to the perspectives that you don't experience, or that your constituency may not experience. And I mean, that definitely is partnering. At the same time, it takes, I think, I would imagine that it would definitely take a lot of listening, as opposed to more listening than it is giving. And, you know, that always is a good posture to take. But perspective is going to be very critical in creating a container like that, understanding that, yeah. So I think it's definitely, it's a great thought to approach the challenge.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Any other thoughts? All right. And as you all, I mean, it sounds like it's, you know, I love that organically kind of the decisions that you all have in front of you have been a part of this dialogue. Because I would also love to hear you all speak a little bit more into, as you start to approach the decisions that you all are going to have to make. You know, they are definitely going to be these are going to be some milestone decisions that you all are coming upon. So we're going to talk a little bit more about, you know, just privilege, what it is, what it isn't, but I really want it to be homegrown, and would love for you all, we're going to take a 10-minute break here. And in the midst of the break, if you're going to do a bio break or just, you know, take a breather, you know, go get some more water or whatever it is, if you can just simply be thinking about, just in your mind and just collectively as a board, and you don't have to go specifically into detail. You can go into as much detail as you'd like, but as you take this 10-minute break, think about in the RTD boardroom, the proverbial Zoom boardroom, what is privilege in this space and what is it not? So we're going to take a 10-minute break, and then, yeah, we'll be back. If you pay attention to your screen, they'll let you know, give you a 5-minute countdown. It'll give you a 1-minute countdown, and then we'll be back on. All right, I'm gonna give about 30 more seconds for folks to come on back, and then we'll jump back in here. Okay, so let's jump on back in. So we're gonna have a little bit more, even make it even more homegrown, and hopefully kind of almost create a workshop in this space to talk about what privilege means specifically amongst the RTD board, what it is, what it isn't, and you know, just kind of how we can just have a conversation about thoughts and perspectives and maybe feelings of resonation of how we can, or how you all can create an environment that acknowledges privilege and leverages that acknowledgement into action. So would love to hear thoughts, if anyone has any thoughts about specifically in the RTD space, what privilege is and or what it isn't. Director DeShield.
Just a quick clarifying question. When we're talking about privilege, are we talking about the privilege that we as a board have as an entity, or the privileges that we have amongst each other? Because I think
Yeah, absolutely. Amongst yourselves. We'll start there, amongst yourselves.
I think time is a giant privilege amongst ourselves. Some people have a ton of time to be able to dedicate to the work, and other people don't. And the privilege of time to engage with constituents, to be at different meetings, to be able to be on calls at all different calls in all different places. Should conferences ever happen again in real life, the ability to have the time to travel to conferences, I think time is a huge privilege.
That's really good. Director Davidson.
I think if we're talking about, you know, privilege amongst ourselves and how we kind of come to the board, certainly one is background and what puts you in a position to be, you know, there's certain skill sets that are valued on board of directors and that are historically valued, and that compounds, and then you're on the board and you look for other skill set, and when you start talking about succession plan and so forth. So I would just even say background and historic skill set is certainly one of the privileges that those among us now are here for some reason, some qualification set that they have.
That's good.
In addition to time.
Director DeShield.
I think access is a big one. And what I mean by access is, I mean access to other, actually this is just among each other. I think still access and how we use it. I think different people have different access to different local government people, different private sponsors, different, whatever the case might be. And it plays into Director Davidson's point about background is the way that sometimes might get leveraged for one community, but isn't able to be leveraged for a different community because that other community, we don't have that access. And so access is a huge privilege that different folks have or don't have or are building. Not necessarily an immutable trait like other notions of privilege, but it is certainly a privilege that some folks have that others don't.
Director Bouquet.
Yeah, I think just kind of going out the very end of what Director Davidson said was a huge point was time. I think time's a huge privilege, when I'm thinking about it. I mean, as some of you might see, still in my classroom from my daytime job. And me balancing out the two jobs itself, I consider myself, a working class individual, and I would find it hard if I had to do this and then have another means of income on top of it. And I think it's huge that, some of us as board members, we might be closer to the age of retirement, or we might have more flexibility with our schedule. But, looking at, and we're pretty accessible with our board meetings of how they are, but I think having that privilege of making the time and, being away from family or being away from potentially another source of income, that's a huge one. I think that's a huge privilege.
That's really good. And I do see your classroom in the background. Director Sloan.
Sure. I liked what Director Bouquet said, because in addition to time, he mentioned flexibility. And I think that might be more important than the amount of time. It's which bucket of time is available for RTD. And I think that should also make us more considerate of RTD writers who have no flexibility, a lot of them, in terms of when they have to be in a certain place. And as Director Lewis has frequently mentioned, you can't be giving public comment if you're obligated to be spending that time somewhere else. And also, of course, the scheduling of our services means we have to recognize the need for reliability in terms of our customers. That's all.
Thank you, Director Sloan. Director DeShiel, did you have your hand up again? I'm sorry.
I did, but I felt like I was taking too many bites of the apple, so I put it back down.
Well, hopefully you're inspired and compelled to put it back up. There's a couple people now before you, so feel free. Director Whitmore.
Yield my time to Bobby. Just kidding. No, I would. Please don't hesitate. One of the odd situations with this whole dynamic of privilege is the underlying mechanism of how we get here. We run for election and we're elected. And I found it interesting. You kind of go, well, do the electorate, how do they know what our flexibility is, or our time, or things of that nature? I'm not saying it's wrong, or it just seems kind of an interesting dynamic, and perhaps that's why there's very few of us elected in the transit world as opposed to being appointed. I don't know, maybe Director Tisdale has thoughts on that, or others, but I just found that the dynamic of the electing process throws a curveball into kind of how maybe privilege is determined outside of our control. I don't know. Just a random thought that came racing through my airspace. So please rescue me, Director DeShiel.
No rescuing needed, Director Whitmore. This actually wasn't what I was going to say, but to build on what you said, I think picking apart elections and access to voting, that is national news and not a thing I think we need to delve into here. But the act of getting on the ballot and the privilege that I certainly have, and I believe most people here have, if not everyone, is English is my first language, and I am fluent in English. And you cannot get a petition in a different language. I tried, I asked. Petitions to get on the ballot are only available in English, despite if you have a census district that is primarily Spanish speaking, or or an African language or any other census protected language. So there's immense privilege in our literacy, which impacts our ability to even be elected and organize communities to help get us elected. The other piece that I was, the literacy piece is what I was going to touch on, but the other piece I'm thinking of is even our ability to all interact here now. We have reliable access to broadband, internet, right? That is, an RTD supports us in getting that set up, but it's still an incredible privilege that we are all once, twice, multiple times a week have not only broadband, but enough broadband to download things, to upload things, to sit on video, and to have it be hopefully strong enough that if there's someone else in our house who needs it for work, they can also use the video. It's a huge privilege that we have. I think is shared here.
Thank you, Director DeShiel. Director Tisdale.
Thank you very much. Just to go back to Director Whitmore's question on elected versus appointed, my view, a person who has had 7 elections, won 5 of them, I look at appointed boards as being, to me, the epitome of privilege, because it is whom you know and what connection you have with them and so forth, whereas an election is a very different proposition. So just to respond to that one point, I think that an elected board does not represent a sense of privilege, whereas I think an appointed board most assuredly does. Thank you.
Point well taken.
So I'm going to do a quick exercise here and just have us talk a little bit about what privilege isn't. And the reason I'm doing that is I want to bring into this conversation and just get thoughts and comments on just how privilege can, in fact, cause, the disruption and cause some damage. And at the same time, acknowledging that it does exist and kind of talking through just how you all collectively as a board can start seeking perspectives of others. So as I ask what privilege isn't, I'm going to start by saying one thing that I truly believe that it isn't is unifying. It typically is something that will find its way to cause divisiveness amongst a collective body of leadership. It will divide communities. And so just would love to just hear other thoughts of what privilege isn't, or what does that bring into the dynamic as you all are looking to partner to support RTD and RTD's initiative and, create an equitable access and experience for the ridership. Director DeShiel.
Say it isn't equal either, and it also isn't it isn't equal or fair.
Other thoughts?
It is certainly not a competition.
Nice. I think another thing that it's not natural to recognize when you when you have it and you're experiencing it, it is not natural to recognize it, and it is hard to acknowledge. And I will also say, I mean, I'm not sure it's always needed in this space, but anytime I have conversations about privilege, I do want to say out loud that it is not exclusive to the wealthy or to the white community. We all do have spaces where we can essentially find ourselves, in privilege. Now, I also will say that it definitely is prevalent in folks that have, wealth, and it can be much more prevalent for people in the white community, but it's not exclusive. So I definitely also want to acknowledge that piece of it as well. Okay, so I'm gonna push us back into the presentation because I would love to talk about, just as a board, what you all's thoughts are on how do you target inclusion when you do know that there is a presence of privilege. And you can apply this to both yourselves as board members, and also if it resonates with your constituency as well, that's totally fine. So when we do realize privilege, just want to kind of talk about what happens. So what do you think can happen if we all buy into and we do formally realize that privilege is in fact present? What do you all think can happen? Or maybe I should phrase it and say, what can be gained? Director Davidson, I'll let you answer and then I'll ask the question a different way.
Yeah, thanks. I'll just say, I mean, it's a chance to rearrange the seats. And again, I think, when you break it down, you can see the individual rows and where the issues are. So I'm going to take a really simple and easy one, but to Director Deschelle and Director Bouquet's comment about time. If time is difficult and we recognize that that's a privilege, or actually, I love the comment that Director Sloan made about flexibility. That's a big one, for sure. So if we recognize that that's a privilege, flexibility, then we can start to rearrange the seats by planning when we have meetings, how we have meetings, all those types of things. So it gives the opportunity to focus on a particular area where privilege exists and look at whether there's an opportunity to rearrange the seats.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It does give an opportunity to start to reimagine and to rethink how things are done. What do you all think can be gained from the board if privilege is realized? What can be gained in addition to what Director Davidson said? But what else can be gained from that? Director Sloan.
Well, I'm uncomfortable of viewing it as a blanket privilege. You're privileged or you're not privileged. I like Director Davidson's idea better of analyzing, the whole scope of privilege and which segments of the board can serve in different ways. If we understand the talents and the privileges of each of us, I think as a body, we can be much more effective than just saying privilege or not privilege. And we need to make everybody equal.
Thank you for that, Director Sloan. So do you think that privilege essentially in that model, can it be eradicated to where you do create an environment and a container for this board to function with the eradication of privilege?
I don't see the point as being eradicating privilege. I see it much more nuanced than that. That people have different opportunities or privileges. and they can be used to make the board function better if we do recognize them rather than try to wipe them out.
Got it. Yeah.
And I'll add to that. For instance, time. Yes, I do have more time that I can devote to RTD or somewhere else. And that should take the pressure off of people who are working 8 to 5 and have young families at home. So yes, it is a privilege, but it also can be used to support the RTD board.
Got it. So realizing the privilege may, in fact, create an opportunity to, like time, for instance, if there is an imbalance there that, you know, I have more time than someone else does, then there's an opportunity for you and I to build a meaningful relationship. And when, you know, if my voice needs to be, or my constituency needs to be at the table, or if there's something that needs to be done, because you have more time that you would be able to invest in that, I could leverage you for that type of support. Is that what you're saying? Gotcha. Okay. Got it. Director Tisdale.
Thank you. Yes, and I was about to say something very similar to that, that as I hear this discussion developing, it is that we can acknowledge the unique privileges of each of us and then use those privileges to leverage results for the benefit of all of us. That's how I would summarize my understanding of this discussion.
Director Bouquet.
If it's okay, I actually might be looking at a kind of a different interpretation potentially of, you know, what privilege exists on the board, and, you know, and maybe looking collectively as an entire agency, specifically for our commuters and our passengers. That's what I kind of look into it, in which, hey, we, you know, it's not only acknowledging that there is a certain privilege among us as 15 board members. It goes again to acknowledging that, you know, that privilege isn't necessarily going to go into all of our communities that we serve, and potentially the typical rider that we have isn't necessarily having the privilege, you know, to be part of this board or have the means to be ultimately on this board. You know, again, be it time, be it the financial resources to, you know, run an entire campaign. And I think it's more of a reflection that, based on, you know, potentially the privilege that we have as board members and the connections that we have as board members, how can we ultimately help our constituents? How can we ultimately be the voice of our constituents, you know, to better our community, to kind of get a better understanding, and, you know, show a little bit more empathy, to be honest. I think that going outside of, you know, how can we better ourselves as members of the board, but rather, you know, our betterment as a board should translate into the betterment of our community, you know, and actually have a better understanding of what our community might be going through. They don't have the time. They might not have the special privileges that we do. And therefore we should, you know, find the resources we can to help folks out.
Thank you, Director Bouquet. And I think that was a great outlook. I mean, by all means, that was a really thoughtful approach to the answer to the question, you know, tying it into the constituency. So yeah, thank you for that. Any other thoughts? All right, so we're going to wrap up here for today. We have a session tomorrow. So Director Tisdale, I know that you are doing this on my graphic about equality, so I can't wait to hear what you have to say about it tomorrow. But that's a great cliffhanger, so everybody has to tune back in tomorrow to hear about that. But a couple of things that I want to leave you all with that I would love for you all to just be thinking about. Oh, Director Whitmore, did you raise your hand?
That was inadvertent, sorry.
No, no problem. No worries. So yeah, so a couple of things to be thinking about, you know, as we conclude the conversation, at least for the moment, about privilege. I would love for you all to just take some time and think about what kind of targets of inclusion you all as a board can really focus on, especially as you go into you're going into the milestone decisions and any decisions that and any support that you provide to the RTD as they push to their performance targets, any kind of decisions that you all have to make that are going to really impact that. Thinking about targets of inclusion, how can you all as a board be the model and create a template, set an example, and lead this city and how you all feel with privilege in the room, how you still target inclusion. What opportunities do you all have to be innovative, to preserve what you're doing that's working, to reimagine what might not be working, and just really collectively target opportunities for inclusion? Because when it comes to privilege, those that are without it in any regard, whatever the privilege is, those that are without it are constantly being reminded that they don't have it. And those that have it, we typically, we don't even have to think about it because it's something that is bestowed, right? It's something that we automatically have access to. So we don't have to think about what it feels like not to have it. But those that don't have it are constantly being reminded that they don't. So thinking about it from that lens and always working internally to ensure that you lower your defenses, especially when you do acknowledge that there is a privilege that you have. It is not a denial of your hard work. It never will be a denial of your hard work, but acknowledging that and pulling down those defenses, because when we're handing it over, right? When we're saying, okay, I acknowledge I have privilege. Now I'm going to actually take action. That does, in fact, sometimes, most times, say I need to hand it over. I need to ensure that instead of this being 3 rows, and I'm trying to get my ball in the bucket, this is now going to be a circle, and I've got to continue to leverage my skill set, and it's going to be opportunity for a lot more balls to be in the bucket. And what does that mean? What do more balls of paper in this trash barrel? What does that mean for me? But handing it over doesn't mean that you're losing that privilege. It just simply means that there is now an equitable opportunity for everyone to experience and to leverage opportunity in the same fashion. And as best you can in this space as a board, make it personal. Make it personal. Learn about the stories of those that are not experiencing the privileges that you might have or that your constituency might have. Because when you make it personal, you really do have an opportunity to truly lean in, and you can start to imagine how you can be a part of the resolution. So I'm going to leave you all with those final thoughts. Tomorrow night when we talk, we are going to talk about perspective, the power of perspective, a false sense of power, and we're going to go through the remainder of this particular session. But just want to leave you with those thoughts. And as you all come back to this tomorrow, one thing that I would love to hear, if anyone wants to share, is just what your thoughts are on how you all can target inclusion. I would love for you to make it personal, or say as a board member I can, and also as a board member we can. I think that would be a great exercise if everybody is able and willing. Would love to hear thoughts on that. Director Cook. I think you're on mute, Director Cook.
Yeah, finally off. I'm sorry about that. So I'm slow. First of all, apologies, because I could have raised my hand a few minutes ago, but a couple of comments that made me want to say this. Our constituencies aren't monolithic. They're not all, even if demographically it tends to be one way, older, whatever it is, they're not all that way. So I I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's important to reflect on the fact that we don't have constituencies that are all one type of person or one demographic, for example. So thinking about not serving an age or a whole community means you're not going to serve people of color there, or people who have disabilities, or who are completely transit dependent. So, I mean, if we're going to talk about it being a matter of numbers, we're going to serve the most where we can. I still think it's important to recognize the impact that that decision has on people who are not all of one stripe. I don't know if we can take that up tomorrow, but that would be helpful for me.
Absolutely, and that's very powerful, Director Cook, because you're right. It's in the communities that we serve or that we lead. That's what you want. You want to be able to celebrate the differences. You want to be able to acknowledge that there are different paths of life, and I do think that leans into perspective. And how do we seek out perspective? And when we get it, what do we do with it? We will talk about that a little bit more tomorrow. Would love to, engage with you in that regard, and would love to hear responses, thoughts, and things that resonate with you. So definitely am excited about you being bold in your voice as we have that conversation tomorrow. But I do think that it does come in perspective, and we will talk about that tomorrow about, again, how we seek it, and when we get it, what the heck do we do with it? So. All right, so that concludes my piece of this. So in spirit of the person that passed me the baton, Director Busick, I'm going to pass it back to you unless there's someone else that needs to close this out. So back to you, Director Busick.
You may have stepped away, so I will close us out. Thanks very much, Median. It was a good session, and we're on again at 5:30 tomorrow, right? I'm afraid I'll be late. I have a constituent meeting, but I'm hoping to get here before too long. Thanks.
Thank you all.
Good night, all. Good night.
Thanks, Median.
Thanks.